Have you ever started something and felt in those first few days like this time was genuinely different? You signed up or you began or you made the decision and there was this clean, almost electric feeling of forward motion. You were consistent. You were thinking about it even when you weren't doing it. You told someone maybe, or you didn't tell anyone because you wanted to protect it, keep it yours. Either way, it felt real. It felt like you had finally found the version of yourself who follows through. And then, somewhere between 2 weeks and 2 months in, something shifted. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of failure, no catastrophe that ended it. The energy just thinned. You skipped one day, then two. You told yourself you'd return to it when things settled down, when you felt more like yourself. And somewhere in that quiet drift, the thing you started with such genuine intention became another item in the long, private list of things you once cared about and somehow stopped. And the worst part isn't the stopping. The worst part is the story you build around it. That you're someone who burns bright and burns out. That you don't have what it takes. That other people have some quality, discipline, willpower, drive that you were either born without or quietly forfeited somewhere along the way. I want to dismantle that story, not with reassurance, but with something more useful. An accurate explanation of what is actually happening in your brain and body when motivation collapses and why it has very little to do with your character. Let me reframe this. The collapse of early motivation is not a personality event. It is a neurochemical one. The feeling you had at the beginning, that clarity, that pull, that sense of momentum was produced by specific biological processes that are, by design, temporary. They were never meant to last. And the fact that they faded is not evidence that you failed. It is evidence that your brain is functioning exactly as it was built to. The problem is that no one told you this. So when the feeling left, you concluded that you had left. That's the error. And it's a costly one. To understand what's happening, you need to understand something about dopamine, which is probably the most misrepresented chemical in popular psychology. Most people think dopamine is the pleasure chemical. The reward, the hit you get when something good happens. But that's not quite right. Dopamine is more accurately described as the anticipation chemical. It spikes not in response to reward, but in response to the prediction of reward. It is released in the gap between wanting and having, and it is most active when the outcome is new, uncertain, and feels significant. This is why starting something new feels so alive. Your brain has detected novelty. It has generated a prediction. This could be something, and it is flooding your system with dopamine to drive you toward finding out. Neuroscientists call the mechanism driving this a predictionary signal. When reality exceeds your brain's prediction, dopamine surges. When reality meets prediction. When the outcome is exactly what you expected, dopamine levels off. And when reality falls short, dopamine drops. Here's a critical implication. The longer you do something, the more accurately your brain can predict what it will feel like. And the more accurately it can predict the feeling, the less dopamine it releases in anticipation. The novelty fades. The uncertainty resolves, and the chemical engine that was propelling you forward quietly idles down. This is not failure. This is prediction accuracy. Your brain has learned the thing, and a brain that has learned something stops treating it as an open question worth pursuing at full chemical intensity. Think of early motivation like a flare. A flare is not designed to burn indefinitely. It's designed to burn brilliantly, briefly, to illuminate something in the dark so you can get your bearings. The mistake most people make is treating the flare as the fuel source. They think the flare is what the journey runs on. When it dims, they conclude the journey is over. But the flare was never the fuel. It was just the beginning of the light. The actual fuel for sustained effort is something quieter, less spectacular, and far more durable. It's built differently, and building it takes time. Here's another way to understand what happens mid-project. Your brain, when it first commits to a new goal, is something like a courtroom in its opening statements. Everything is vivid and charged. The case feels urgent. The stakes feel enormous. The lawyer is pacing, gesturing, building a case that feels irrefutable. But somewhere in the middle of the trial, the long middle, where evidence is being examined line by line, the drama recedes. The gallery empties a little. The attention drifts. The urgency that opened the proceedings has been replaced by the patient, unglamorous work of actually deciding. And most people mistake the loss of courtroom drama for the loss of the case itself. They're not the same thing. Why is the brain designed this way? Because novelty seeking and efficient resource allocation don't coexist easily, and for most of human history. Your brain's job was not to help you finish a book or maintain a workout habit. Its job was to keep you alive and to prioritize the allocation of metabolic energy toward what was most uncertain, most new, most potentially threatening or rewarding. Cognitive scientists call this the exploit trade-off. Your brain is constantly making a quiet calculation. Should I continue doing what I know works, or should I redirect attention toward exploring something new that might work better? In environments of scarcity and novelty, biasing heavily toward exploration made evolutionary sense. What's new deserves attention. What's known is already handled. The difficulty is that most meaningful modern pursuits, building a skill, writing something long, changing a health pattern, require exactly the kind of sustained exploitation that the brain finds metabolically expensive and motivationally uninteresting. You're asking a system optimized for novelty to commit deeply to the familiar. That's not impossible, but it requires understanding the system well enough to work with it rather than against it. There's also a concept here called mental contrasting, the cognitive pattern that researchers Gabriel Oettingen have studied extensively. When we imagine a desired future without equally imagining the obstacles between us and it, we get a motivational spike, but it tends to be short because the brain registers the imagined achievement as if it were partially real and partially releases the tension that was driving the effort. The high of imagining the finish line quietly reduces the urgency to cross it. This is why pure positive visualization, despite its cultural popularity, often predicts worse outcomes than no visualization at all. Your brain is not betraying you when motivation fades. It is following its own very sensible logic that was shaped over millennia for a world that no longer quite exists. So how do you work with this system rather than against it? 3 levels. Let's start with level 1, structural tools. These address the architecture of motivation before the fade begins. The most important is what researchers call implementation intentions, a more precise version of planning that links behavior to context rather than to feeling. Instead of I'll work on this when I'm motivated, the structure becomes when this specific thing happens. I do this specific action. The context becomes the trigger, and feeling is removed from the equation entirely. This is not about willpower. It is about offloading the decision from the emotional brain to the environmental one. The second structural tool is deliberate novelty injection. Because dopamine responds to unpredictability, you can partially reintroduce it by varying the conditions of your practice, the location, the sequence, the format. This is not inconsistency. It is strategic freshness applied to a stable underlying commitment. Same direction, different texture. Now level 2, perceptual tools. These change what you're measuring, which changes what your brain is rewarding. Most people measure outcomes, the finished draft, the lost weight, the skill acquired. The problem is that outcomes are slow to arrive and invisible in the middle. The brain stops releasing dopamine for progress. It can't see. The correction is to deliberately track process. Not what you produced, but what you did. Minutes logged, pages touched, sessions completed. This shifts the reward signal from the invisible future outcome to the visible present action. Your brain can release dopamine for a process completed today. It cannot reliably do so for an outcome that remains weeks or months away. The second perceptual tool is reframing the middle itself. Most projects have a beginning, an end, and a long, narratively inert middle. The middle is where motivation goes to die, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing feels like it's happening. Learning to recognize the middle as the functional core of any endeavor, rather than an obstacle between two interesting parts, is a cognitive reorientation that takes practice. But it is the most important one. Finishing is a middle section skill. And lastly, level 3, recovery and reset tools. When the fade has already happened, when you've already drifted, already stepped away, the re-entry matters enormously. The most common mistake is trying to re-enter at the level of intensity you left. This guarantees re-failure because the conditions that produce the initial surge are gone. Instead, re-enter smaller than feels necessary. Embarrassingly small. 5 minutes. 1 paragraph. A single set. The goal of re-entry is not productivity. It is identity recontact. A brief low-stakes reminder that you are still someone who does this thing. The neurological reassociation matters more than the output. You are rebuilding a self-signal not catching up on lost time. And give yourself permission to grieve the flare. There is a real loss when the beginning feeling ends. Something vivid and orienting has gone quiet. Acknowledging that honestly, rather than pathologizing it or pretending it doesn't matter, is part of what allows you to move into the less dramatic, more durable work of the middle without resentment. Here's what I want you to hold on to. The people who finish things, who build skills, complete projects, sustain effort across months and years, are not people who never lost motivation. They are people who stopped relying on it. They developed a relationship with their work that didn't depend on the work, always feeling alive, always feeling charged, always producing that early electricity. They learned to show up in the ordinary register, the undramatic middle, the days when nothing felt significant and the work happened anyway. That is not a diminished version of passion. It is a matured one. The flair is not the story. The flair is the introduction. What comes after, the quieter, harder, less visible, sustained effort, that is where the actual thing gets made. That is where identity solidifies. That is where you find out not who you are when you feel inspired, but who you are when the feeling has passed and you're still there. And the fact that you're watching this, that you're still curious, still trying to understand, still looking for a better way to work with yourself rather than against yourself. That tells me something about you. It tells me the flair hasn't been the only thing keeping you going. There's something else in there. Something quieter and considerably more reliable. Learn to trust that part. It's the part that finishes things.